at exactly 3:17 a.m. on a rainy night in the United States. Something truly terrifying happened. Inside an old forgotten hotel, security cameras captured an event that defied all logic. Down a long, dimly lit hallway, every single door swung open at the exact same moment. The footage was chillingly clear, but what it showed was impossible. There was no one there. Not a single person could be seen. The hallway was completely empty. This inexplicable event was just the beginning of a story that would baffle investigators and become a modern legend of the unexplained. It all started earlier that night with a lone traveler named Daniel. Daniel was driving down a desolate stretch of highway when his car sputtered to a stop. Stranded and with a powerful storm brewing, he had no choice but to seek shelter at the only building for miles, the Ravenwood Hotel. It was an old, imposing structure that most travelers instinctively avoided, its silhouette dark and unwelcoming against the stormy sky. But for Daniel, it was his only option. He grabbed his bag and ran through the pouring rain to the front entrance. As he pushed open the heavy wooden doors, a wave of musty, cold air hit him. The lobby was a time capsule of neglect. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. A small, tarnished bell sat on the reception desk, waiting. Daniel hesitated for a moment, the silence of the place unnerving him. He tapped the bell, and the sharp, piercing ring echoed through the cavernous building, seeming to awaken something within its walls. After a few long, tense moments, a figure emerged from the shadows behind the desk. It was an old man, the hotel receptionist. He moved slowly, almost unnaturally, and his face was pale, almost translucent in the dim light. A strange, fixed smile was plastered on his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. The sight of him sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. Without a word, the old man slid a tarnished brass key across the counter. The tag attached to it was engraved with the number 307. Daniel took the key, his hand trembling slightly. He thanked the man, who just continued to smile his unsettling smile. As Daniel turned and walked towards the staircase, the lights in the long hallway leading to the rooms began to flicker erratically. Each step he took seemed to sink into the old, creaky floorboards. The building was unnervingly quiet. The only sound, the distant rumble of thunder and the pounding of his own heart. He finally reached the third floor and found his room. 307. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. At first glance, the room looked ordinary, if a bit dated. There was a bed, a small table, and a door leading to a bathroom. But an overwhelming feeling of wrongness hung in the air, a cold spot that seemed to follow him. He felt like he was being watched. He dropped his bag on the floor and walked over to the large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. He stared at his own reflection, his face pale from the ordeal. And then he saw it. For just a split second, a dark, shadowy figure stood directly behind him in the reflection. He whipped around, his heart pounding in his chest. There was nothing there. The room was empty. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was just a trick of the light, his mind playing games after a stressful night. He walked into the bathroom to splash some water on his face, trying to calm his nerves. Suddenly, the faucet turned on by itself, blasting hot water into the sink. Steam filled the small room, fogging up the mirror completely. Daniel watched in horror as letters began to form on the glass, as if an invisible finger was writing a message just for him. The words were clear. "Do not stay here." Before he could even process the warning, the lights in the entire room flickered and then went out completely, plunging him into total darkness. At that exact moment, a brilliant flash of lightning lit up the sky, illuminating the room through the window for a fleeting second. What Daniel saw in that flash made his blood run cold. The room was no longer the one he had entered. It was decayed and ruined. The wallpaper was peeling. The furniture was broken and deep. Vicious scratches covered every inch of the walls, as if a wild animal had been trapped inside. When the darkness returned, a new sound filled the air. Whispers. They seemed to come from all around him, from the very walls themselves. Faint, overlapping voices, speaking in a language he couldn't understand, yet he could feel their malevolent intent. Panique set in. Daniel scrambled for the door, his hands fumbling for the knob in the dark. He found it and twisted, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled and pushed with all his might, but the door was sealed shut. He was trapped. Desperate, he turned back to the room, another flash of lightning briefly showing him the way to the large mirror on the wall. He stumbled towards it, hoping to see something, anything that could explain what was happening. He looked into the glass, and his own terrified reflection stared back, but he wasn't alone. Behind his reflection, dozens of ghostly faces had appeared. They were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and black, and they were all staring directly at him. Their lips moved in unison, and this time the whispers became clear. A single, terrifying invitation that echoed in his mind. Stay with us. The lights in the room began to flicker violently, strobing between blinding light and absolute darkness, revealing the ghostly faces one moment and plunging him into blackness the next. The whispering grew louder and louder, a deafening chorus of spectral voices. And then, with one final, violent flicker, everything went completely dark and silent. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun shone down on the Ravenwood Hotel, making it look almost peaceful. Police officers arrived at the scene after finding Daniel's abandoned car on the side of the highway. They entered the lobby, calling out his name, but were met with only silence. As they searched the dusty reception area, one of the officers noticed a wall covered in old, faded photographs. They were portraits of past guests, smiling faces from decades gone by. But one photograph stood out. It was new, the image crisp and clear, as if it had just been taken. The officers leaned in for a closer look. Their faces turned pale. The picture showed Daniel. He was standing in the hotel hallway, his face a mask of pure terror, and behind him, surrounding him, were several dark, shadowy figures, their forms indistinct, but their presence undeniable. As the officers stared in disbelief at the impossible photograph, they heard a soft click from behind them. They turned around just in time to see the heavy front door of the Ravenwood Hotel slowly swing shut on its own, sealing them inside with the secrets of the past. The hotel had claimed another guest. 2 days had passed since Daniel vanished without a trace. The local police, initially baffled, decided to return to the scene of his disappearance, the Ravenwood Hotel. As their patrol car pulled up, they saw Daniel's vehicle, still parked exactly where he'd left it, and silent, lonely sentinel. The hotel itself seemed to have sunk further into gloom, its imposing facade now looking more like a mausoleum than a place of rest. Stepping inside, the officers were met with an atmosphere thick with neglect. The lobby, which had been eerie before, was now shrouded in an even deeper darkness. A fine layer of dust coated every surface, suggesting a long period of disuse. But then, one of the officers, a seasoned detective named Miller, stopped dead. His flashlight beam danced across the floor, illuminating something that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Fresh footprints. Not theirs. They were clean, distinct, cutting a path through the dust, and they all led in one direction, down to long foreboding hallway, with a shared honest glance. Miller and his younger partner, Officer Chun, drew their service weapons. Every instinct screamed at them to turn back, but duty compelled them forward. They followed the trail of footprints, their own heavy steps echoing unnaturally in the oppressive silence. The lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Along the walls hung a gallery of old, faded paintings, portraits of stern-faced individuals whose eyes seemed to follow their every move. The air grew colder, heavier. With each step, they took deeper into the hotel's belly. It was June who noticed the anomaly first. He paused, his flashlight beam fixed on a brass sign on the wall. "Miller, look at this," he whispered, his voice tight. Miller joined him, his gaze following the light. The sign displayed the room numbers for the third floor. 301, 302, 305. A gap. The numbers 303 and 304 were simply gone, as if they had never existed. Yet, the hallway stretched on, with more doors visible in the distance. It was architecturally impossible, a deliberate, unsettling flaw in the building's design. A cold knot of dread tightened in Miller's stomach. This place was wrong. Pressing on, they reached the end of the hallway. There it was, room 37. The very room Daniel had been assigned. The door was ajar, hanging open just a few inches. A silent, dark invitation. Miller pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room inside was cloaked in shadows, but the faint light from the hallway revealed a scene frozen in time. Daniel's travel bag was sitting neatly on a small wooden table, as if he had just set it down. But of Daniel there was no sign. The room was empty, yet it felt crowded, watched. Miller swept his flashlight across the room, the beam landing on a large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. For a split second, a flicker of movement in the reflection caught his eye. A dark shape, a human silhouette, standing directly behind him. Espunaron, weapon raised, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nothing. The room was empty. Chun looked at him, confused. What is it? Miller shook his head, trying to rationalize what he'd seen. A trick of the light. A shadow. It. At. To be. Suddenly, a loud gush of water broke the silence. Both officers jumped, their heads snapping toward the bathroom. The tap had turned on by itself, hot water blasting into the sink. Thick steam billowed out, quickly fogging the bathroom mirror. And then, through the condensing vapor, letters began to form, as if an invisible finger was tracing them onto the glass. For chilling words emerged from the mist. You should not have returned. Panic. Set. Ing. The lights in the room began to flicker violently, strobing between blinding brightness and total darkness. Let's go. Now. Millet yelled, grabbing Chun's arm. They scrambled for the door, but just as they reached it, it slammed shut with a deafening boom that shook the entire room. They were trapped. A low, guttural whispering started to fill the air, seeming to come from the walls themselves. It wasn't one voice, but dozens, maybe hundreds, all murmuring in a discordant chorus. Stay with us. The words slithered into their minds, cold and persuasive. The temperature plummeted. Their breath plumed in the air, the chills seeping into their bones. Miller fumbled with the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. It was as if it had been welded shut. Chun was staring at the mirror, his face a mask of pure terror. Miller. The mirror. Miller turned. A thin crack snaked its way across the glass, spreading like a spiderweb. And within the fractured reflection, the room was no longer empty. Dozens of ghostly figures were now visible, packed together, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and black. They weren't just in the mirror. They were staring out of it, directly at the two trapped men. One of the figures, a woman with long, dark hair, raised a hand and pressed her palm against the inside of the glass. More cracks spiderwebbed from the point of contact. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. A cacophony of spectral voices begging them to join. Chun let out a choked scream as the main overhead light exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the room into absolute darkness. And then, as suddenly as it began, everything went silent. The next morning, when the two officers failed to report in, the police chief himself led a team to the Ravenwood Hotel. The building was silent, still. In the lobby, investigators found nothing out of the ordinary at first, just dust and decay. But then a young forensics tech made a terrifying discovery. He was examining the wall of old, black and white photographs of past hotel guests. "Chief," he called out, his voice trembling. "You need to see this." The chief walked over, and his blood ran cold. On the wall, among the century-old portraits, were two new photographs. They were crisp, clear, and looked as if they had been taken just hours ago. In one, Officer Miller stood stiffly, his eyes wide with a terror that was permanently captured. In the other stood Officer Chun, his expression identical. They were standing beside a third man, Daniel, and behind the three of them, fading into the background, stood a crowd of dark, shadowy figures, their featureless faces all turned, staring directly at the camera. As the investigators stood frozen in horror, the heavy front door of the Ravenwood Hotel slowly swung closed, sealing the darkness within.